Hello everyone, my name is Aaron Christensen and this is Horror 101 with Dr. AC, a gathering place for fellow fiends the world over to discuss all things freaky and frightening. If you want to be part of the conversation, and I hope you do, I invite you to like this video, subscribe to the channel, maybe go back and check out some of our previous episodes, leave a comment, and most importantly, let us know the fright flicks you'd like to discuss in the future. That kind of connection is exactly what we're looking for, and it really does make a difference. We're all about sharing the scare, and we want to hear from you. Released the same year as The Exorcist, The Wicker Man also wrestles with religious rituals and fading faith. While the former was an instantaneous sensation that garnered Oscar nominations and huge box office receipts, its poor British relations suffered the indignities of studio-imposed edits and general public disinterest. However, as time has shown, this literal cult classic has endured for 50 years and is now regarded one of the finest horror movies of the early 1970s. As loosely adapted from David Pinner's 1967 novel Ritual by playwright Anthony Shaffer, Edward Woodward stars as the hard-as-nails Sergeant Howie, who arrives on the remote island community of Summerisle searching for a missing child, Rowan Morrison. To his surprise, most of the inhabitants deny the existence of the child, and, when pressed, express no remorse at her absence. As Lord Summerisle, Hammer horror stalwart Christopher Lee turns in one of its finest performances, and extraordinary support is provided by Britt Ekland, Ingrid Pitt, and Diane Cilento, as well as the entire ensemble. Director Robin Hardy skillfully crafts an atmosphere-drenched mystery, with Paul Giovanni's quirky folk songs adding an unexpected, high-spirited frolic to the dread proceedings. Like the celebrated apples of Summerisle, The Wicker Man is a film that succeeds when it shouldn't and endures as a truly original, mesmerizing, and unforgettable cinematic experience. I'm thrilled to be discussing The Wicker Man on its 50th anniversary, and I've gotten another amazing panel of guests to chat about it with me. So let's bring everybody in and let's say hello to our fantastic guests. Let's go all the way around. Let's start with Jimmy Searson.
Thanks.
Katie McLean Hainsworth.
Hello.
Chris Hainsworth.
Hello.
Vanessa Morgan.
Hello.
And Alan Tromp. And we are going to be discussing The Wicker Man from 1973, celebrating its 50th anniversary. Thanks for coming on the show, everybody, and welcome. We have quite the assemblage. We have Jimmy beaming in from Sweden. We've got Vanessa coming in from Belgium. We got Alan over in St. Louis. We had Katie and Chris here in Chicago. I am super excited that we have such an eclectic group to discuss this very, very strange little movie. I would love to kind of bounce around and kind of talk about people's first experience with The Wicker Man, and then we can dig deeper into the film itself. Alan, would you mind kicking us off? Where did you see The Wicker Man for the first time?
Surprisingly, one of the local stations here in St. Louis, Channel 11, showed it in the evening. And Channel 11 had kind of a reputation for showing odd things. They showed uncut all of the Filipino Blood Island movies late at night. So they had those in there. And they got in a whole lot of trouble when they were trying to compete with cable when it was coming out, because they showed Looking for Mr. Goodbar uncut at regular hours. So I think they trimmed out some of the young people frolicking on the island a little bit in there, but most of it seemed to be intact. So that's the first place I saw it, was on local evening TV.
Vanessa.
I was living in London back then, and I remember that a friend had a VHS cassette of the film, and we were like, okay, which movie are we gonna watch tonight? And I was still, quite young at that time, so it was like, okay, I've never seen The Wicker Man before, but it looks interesting. Let's try this one. And of course, it stayed with me ever since.
How about you, Chris?
It was definitely one of those raised by cable television experiences of like me being home alone while 12 or 13 and just having the TV on and what's this? And so it was definitely on cable in the early 80s, and I was not quite in high school when I caught it. So, but the final image has stayed with me for 40 years. So,
Katie.
This one passed me by. I admit the first time I saw it was like a month ago. And then we
awesome.
watched it again yesterday. I had always been curious about it and always wanted to see it. And of course, heard all about the other movie, the remake of it. And so the mystique of it all fascinated me. But I will admit that after watching the first one, I was like, I'm not going to watch the remake.
Jimmy, bring us home. When did you encounter The Wicker Man for the first time?
Well, it was almost 20 years ago when it was released on DVD in Great Britain. So I had to import it. It was recommended as one of those cult classics I might have missed, because I think it's almost more well known today, actually.
Yeah, I'd say that is true. I came across it from various reference books, in my youth, leafing through the public library in the 70s. And there was always that image of Christopher Lee with his hair blowing in the wind and his hands raised above his head. But unlike you, Alan, they never seemed to play The Wicker Man on TV. It just never seemed to come my way. I never found it in any VHS form. And it was only when it came out, I want to say DVD, the same, right around that early 2000s when Studio Canal put it out, that I went, oh my God, I can finally see this movie. And I remember very clearly watching it and just like the spell kind of weaving its way over me. And when it was over, I was like, oh my gosh. And I immediately watched it again. So I was like, did that just happen? It has had a spell over me from that moment on. And I was thrilled to include it in my first book, Horror 101, because it's so interesting that it came out not only the same year, but the same month as The Exorcist. It came out in December 1973. But while The Exorcist just exploded, The Wicker Man just kind of fizzled and never seemed to find an audience. I mean, there are stories of Christopher Lee like begging critics to review it so that people would come and see it. It's had a very labored life, but as you say, Jimmy, it's well known now. We can thank the remake for raising its profile a little bit.
But have they seen the remake, or have they just seen the memes?
They might have just seen the bees clip, and maybe that's enough. Maybe that's enough. If we can talk a little bit about the movie itself, specifically the presence of Christopher Lee, because this was coming at a time when Hammer was kind of on its way out. Christopher Lee was an international superstar. His presence in the film made it a horror film almost de facto, but it's a very unusual type of horror film. I mean, it kind of worms its way in. Chris, I'm curious, you having seen it at a younger age, how did it work for you seeing it young?
I remember being very confused because because 12 years old, I didn't have a whole lot of experience with the concept of paganism and the idea of like polytheism and all of these other, and I had not gotten into things like Stephen King, these ideas of these small communities that, have their own belief system. So quite frankly, at 12, I remember Britt Ekland and, and that final image and trying to be like, why are they doing that? For a 12, 13-year-old suburban kid, it was kind of altering because it introduced a whole lot of concepts I hadn't brushed up against at that point.
And how versed in horror were you at that point?
I was getting back into horror at that point. I think I've mentioned to you previously that when I was 4, somebody put on Carnival of Souls, and I watched that and then had to sleep with the light on until I was about 12. So I avoided horror movies for those years. So this was, and there's nothing about the title, The Wicker Man, that says this is a horror movie, particularly because like all the way up until the last 5 minutes, it's like, why is he the Wicker Man? Is it a metaphor? No, there's a literal Wicker Man that he's being put into.
Yeah, I would say it's more, it's almost more of a mystery throughout, as opposed to a straight up horror film. Certainly what we had come to expect from a British horror film at that point. Vanessa, tell us a little bit like how it landed for you, like, again, as a younger viewer.
It really depended on when I watched it, because after I watched it the first time, I watched it several times again in the years that followed. I think for me, the first time I watched it, even though I watched a lot of horror movies, I can't say I was very wise at that time. So it was more superficial. And what I liked about it was, like you said, it starts off as a mystery. And so you know that something is going on the island, and that something is not quite right, but you're not expecting the entire sacrifice from the end. That just and that's what I really liked about it. It was really shocking to me at that time. But then later on, when I watched it several times more, I became more interested in the juxtaposition of the several religions and how they are both right and wrong at the same time, and how they both believe so very hard in what they're doing. And I think that made it really interesting, especially also in the end when both groups are praying to their own gods. I thought that was brilliant. And then even more later, I became also more interested in knowing more about pagan culture. And then I started to realize that actually most of what we're seeing is true. It's based on real Celtic traditions and rituals. Like with the bonfires, there were a lot of animal sacrifices. And apparently there were accounts from Julius Caesar that he noticed that the Druids were doing human sacrifices in giant wicker structures.
Jimmy, how versed of a horror fan were you when you came to it for the first time? Like, did you have some expectations of what a horror film was? Because I feel like that's kind of the magic of this film, is that it kind of subverts that expectation.
I came into horror after Scream and all of that, and started with the slashers really. And so I've seen, I saw all of the Friday the 13th that had been released up until that time and such. But I also had seen some like older ghost films and Dracula and such. But it wasn't quite what I expected because, well, I didn't know what I expected, but it's an unusual film. So Christopher Lee didn't even consider it to be a horror film. And I'm kind of on the fence about that, because it turns into a horror film at the end, but it's a very impactful ending for sure. Yeah, and I'm glad I didn't know much about it beforehand, so that's what I would recommend. That don't read too much about it, because the ending is so famous. So the more you read about it, the more likely it will just be spoiled.
I think what you just said is exactly right. It becomes a horror film at the end, and that kind of retroactively turns the rest of the film into a horror film. Like, you go back through and like, oh my gosh, the whole town is in on it. They are absolutely leading this man, to where they want him to go. And I'll just say now, everybody, hey, we're probably going to get into spoilers at some point. So if you haven't seen the movie,
Too late.
Turn it off, turn this off, go watch it, come back, and we'll pick back up. But I think that's kind of what I love about this movie, is that as you're watching that final scene with all the villagers singing and so much joy on their faces, as another person is not having the same experience at all. I think that kind of informs the rest of the movie. Katie, this being kind of like relatively new to you, I'm curious, and you had watched quite a few horror films at this point.
So I knew it was a horror film going into it, which I think maybe is a unique experience on this panel. For the first 80 minutes, I was like, when does it get to be a horror film? But to me, there is horror in it all throughout, particularly on the second viewing, when you realize they drew him here. The inevitability of his fate is locked in from the beginning. They're rejoicing because everything went perfectly according to plan. That really frightens me. That kind of like, I've been screwed for days and didn't even know it, and now it's way too late to do anything about it. So it very much resonates as a horror film to me, though it isn't traditional in many respects. I felt so bad that I missed it growing up, because like The Exorcist and Rosemary's Baby, this would have been the perfect third part of that triumvirate, of religious based horror movies that have for me, a gigantic creep factor, because I was raised without any religion in my household or near me, like, so it's all a big mystery to me. And I have to sort of pick things out from context clues about how people worship and why. And there's no part of me that can bring my experience to that. So it's all what's on the screen. And so that made watching this really, really cool. These two conflicting belief systems where both of them are so arrogant as to believe theirs is right, when really I'm watching it like it's practically the same thing. They're just calling it by different names. So that was really fascinating.
Well, there seems to have been like there's like a resurgent in the exploration and the understanding of folk horror. And this is considered kind of one of the unholy three, with Witchfinder General, Wicker Man, and Blood on Satan's Claw. Those are kind of like the three that kind of form the unholy trinity. So, Alan, you had seen Christopher Lee in a number of roles at this point. I'm guessing, like, you were pretty versed in Hammer horror and whatnot when you came to Wicker Man. Is that correct?
Sure. I'd seen him, of course, in all the Hammer films as Count Dracula. I'd seen him as the villain Scaramanga in the James Bond Man with the Golden Gun, even going back into like when he was in the film Horror Hotel or City of the Dead around 1960, where he played the evil cultist. So it was so refreshing to see him in this role as this joyous pagan, and from what I've read, I think he feels that this is definitely one of his favorite, if not his favorite role that he played. I mean, how many places do you get to say something like Sergeant Howie asks him, "What about the real God? What about the Lord Jesus Christ?" And he says, "Well, he had his chance, and he blew it." Wow, what a thing. Not to begrudge anybody's religious choices. We in the United States were right in the middle of Jerry Falwell, Jimmy Swaggart, the Moral Majority, the 700 Club. With all that going on, honestly, when I first saw this, I didn't have a lot of sympathy for Sergeant Howie. We didn't really have any pagans, unless you want to count the Masons and the DeMolay, that sort of thing, but around where we were. But we saw a lot of people's liberties sort of getting trod underfoot by that. So you have all of this taking place, for the most part, in bright sunlight, beautiful sun, rather than the Gothic, scary, shadowy castles and things. So that again was another change. So you got more than you bargained for, Aaron, with that comment, but I apologize. I'll shut up now.
What you mentioned is something I want to bring up, that idea of, we may not sympathize with Sergeant Howie. He's probably the least likable person in the entire movie. And yet he is our protagonist. He is the person, because he's trying to find a missing child. And that immediately resonates for viewers that were like, well, we want him to find the missing child. And why is this entire island like just dismissing her and not worried about it? Like, he's here on the surface doing an intrinsic good. He's trying to locate a child that's missing. And so even as we dislike him and disagree with his methods, we are like, yeah, but he needs to find Rowan. Like, that's important. And the fact that nobody's cooperating with him gets very frustrating for him and for us. I would love to kind of bounce around if anybody has any comments about the idea of the Christianity versus the pagan, because we do see he's operating from a place of deep spirituality, as are they. And I think several people on the panel have already commented on how there is that war between those two ideologies, and yet they're not too dissimilar.
Well, yeah, I mean, we have Christmas trees because of paganism. It is that idea of this like Katamari Damacy of religion just sort of rolls along and then collects things as it moves on and evolves. So Christopher Lee even makes the point. It's like, well, you believe in transubstantiation and that you eat the body of you. These are your beliefs. Your God was born from a virgin birth. We're talking, and we're saying that ours are jumping across fire to, so there are, if you, and once again, not disparaging anybody's religion, because if you believe in a religion, you really can't call anybody else's religion insane, because religion is an act of faith. The tenets of any religion are otherworldly, and it is an act of faith to believe in them. So to say that, like, well, mine is the true God and you're crazy, is, if you like line them up next to each other, it's like they both sound crazy, but they both inherently believe in them and use them to, like, he uses his religion to bully his way through the town because he is 100% sure he is a man of the law. He is a man of God. You know, he says, where are the Christian values on this? And they're like, we don't have those.
We're not Christian. I also think it's fascinating that the movie chooses to make to voice the more reasonable voice is Christopher Lee, the more charming voice, the more likable voice, the one you want to believe and want to like what he's saying. And he's the bad guy. He's absolutely the bad guy in this, but he's funnier and he's more likable. So you're more willing to be like, yeah, everybody has parthenogenesis in their religion, man. Like, what are you so hung up about? It's fascinating to me.
It might not be the best representative of Christianity, Howie, because he's so narrow-minded.
Yeah.
And I met religious people who were very curious about other people's beliefs also, but he's the opposite of that. And there are people like that too. So.
Well, the idea of a virgin, you know, that the fact that he has been saving himself, like the sexuality in this movie is also a thing that's very much pointed up, in that he believes that sex is wrong or only for a certain purpose. And they absolutely celebrate it, you know, and they celebrate it for the whole song of the landlord's daughter, you know, where they're celebrating like what a goer she is.
Yeah. Well, that's one of the other interesting things in terms of, you have these two sort of religious beliefs butting up against each other, but there is an element of actual magic in that Britt Ekland scene, and in her seducing him through the wall. I'm like, that is like, you know, it suddenly becomes a musical number, and she is in tight, you know, and he is responding to it like it is magic. So in a certain way, that almost like lends more credence to their religious belief system, and that there is actually like a cause and effect of like, I'm doing this thing and it's working.
Yeah, that scene, that's very, you realize second time you watch it that it's, they're testing him. You might not know that first time, but then you go back and realize, oh, they want to see if he's really a virgin, or if he's is willing to stand by his beliefs and all of that. And she was Swedish, the actress, by the way. They had to use a voice actor for her.
And a body double.
Sweden. Yeah, and a body double, yes, which she was upset by.
Yeah, she had a bigger bottom than she really had.
Yes, and she said in an interview she would get fan mail with photos of the body double.
She wouldn't sign them.
No, she wouldn't sign them, exactly. But she would still take the time to send them back and explain that it wasn't her. That's good. And she would be also in already the next year. She would be in a movie in a Bond movie with Christopher Lee, right?
Yep, she's in that same movie.
Gun. Yeah.
Yep. And she was certainly a rising name at that point, if not already a celebrity. So she was definitely there for added marquee value. But that scene of Willow's song, because we have that kind of like breaking the fourth wall where she looks right at the camera, and it's kind of like you have this moment of what's happening? And you know, and she's moving toward, and she's doing this dance, and you know, throwing imaginary things out windows, and you're like, and that's I mean, it doesn't feel like it belongs in any movie, much less a horror movie.
Well, it gives it, I'll say this from the second time around, it gives it the feeling of a ritual that we're just not familiar with at all, or have ever heard of before. It makes no sense. But it really gives the feeling like she's performing this temptation ritual that is part of what they need to do to, as Jimmy said, it's part of what they need to do to consecrate him as their sacrifice.
And we see a lot of rituals throughout this movie, you know, like
my favorite
movie
is the egg.
steeped steeped in ritual.
Yeah, I like the little bit with the toad. She puts the
Yeah.
toad in the dot. Now, it's just sort of like
That wee toad has it cold, doesn't she?
And they have the umbilical cord
Yeah.
that they put
Yeah.
on the
Rowan's
people's
umbilical
grave
cord.
markers, when they pass. And for me, one of the coolest things was, and I don't even know if I knew what this was when I first saw it, but the hand that they put next to
Hand of
Yeah,
Glory.
the hand of glory. I didn't know if I knew what that was, but of course, since then I've read that it's supposed to have the power to make people go to sleep or be paralyzed. In some stories, even unlock things. Thieves supposed to use it.
Well, and that was one where they trust the audience because it just you get to hear like the whispering between the landlord and the landlord's daughter, about what the hand of glory does. And you're like, wait, what's happening? But you see him wake up, and it's such a striking image, the flames coming from the fingers, that even if Sergeant Howie doesn't know what it is, he knows that it's not good, and he knocks it away. But the fact that he, is continuing his search, that he storms his way into people's houses and is kind of who was it that said, like he's using his power almost as a bully, and he's constantly like, people are saying you're going to need to get the authority, and he's like, I am the authority, because he's so used to being the authority on the mainland, and here he's not.
I have a question about the Hand of Glory and him overhearing that conversation. The second time around, it felt to me like that was what was supposed to happen to get him in the costume.
I've honestly never even thought of that.
Delve too deeply into the idea, but just as you saying that now, it was like, because he's sitting there awake and they're talking about how it's supposed to keep him, like it's not working. And so I wonder if he's supposed to overhear that conversation. He's supposed to knock out the landlord and take his stuff and go.
I feel like it is very much one of those, everything goes exactly the way it's supposed to go. Like
even if it doesn't
their
look
scheme.
like it.
Yeah, exactly. Their scheme is exactly what they were anticipating.
Yeah, I mean, it's very pointed that the costume he steals is the fool.
Punch.
I mean, Mr. Punch. It is all very like, and Christopher Lee is ecstatic because it has all gone to plan. He's like, you did a great job, Rowan. Everything. It's like we just did the best show ever, and here you go.
Yeah, Lord Summerisle tells him that you need to get into character as a fool, and you're thinking like, oh no, he's been noticed now the first time you watch it, but then you watch it again, and you realize they already know.
They already know it's him.
Yeah, there's also like an interesting dialogue in the sequel, The Wicker Tree, where Christopher Lee also comes back, and then he starts talking about fate and about their victims, if there's a possibility that they can get out of this. Yeah, Christopher Lee really believes that you can't escape fate, so this is what's supposed to happen.
Yeah, and that is one of the tenets of religions, is everything is fated. It is when they're having their discussion, when Howie's being taken to be sacrificed, and he's like, well, what are you going to do if the crops fail next year? And Christopher Lee's like, they won't, because we're doing this.
And we never get the chance to find out if he's right, which is so painful to me. Like, we don't know if this works. We just know that they succeeded in doing what they wanted to do. And we don't know.
But it is
we
that
don't
idea
get the satisfaction of finding out if they got what they wanted.
Yeah, but it is that idea that I've run across, and particularly fundamentalists, of like, nope, there's God's plan, and well, okay, you said this was going to happen and it didn't. Well, that's, that doesn't actually, I wasn't wrong. I'm not wrong. It's just different than I said. And it's that whole, like, just no matter what happens, the idea that what they believe is, there is no room for doubt in their faith.
Yeah. Because then you have free will, and then people might decide they don't want to worship.
We've talked a little bit about Christopher Lee. I want to briefly jump over to Edward Woodward, who is our main character. I mean, he has to carry this movie. And he pretty much, he was known to the British public as a TV actor. He'd been on a series called Callan from 1967 to 1972, but this was kind of like, him emerging into feature films. And I think he does a really terrific job. I love his kind of bullheadedness and but there's an integrity to him, you know, and that's one of the things that really resonates for me. Alan, have you seen Edward Woodward in anything prior to this, or is this kind of your introduction to him?
I don't know if it was before or after, but I remember him from American TV on being the role of the Equalizer. But I thought he was a really good actor in that. If this wasn't my first exposure to him, it would have been on the TV show The Equalizer.
Mine was in Hot Fuzz.
Oh,
which has many parallels to this movie.
Oh yeah, oh yeah.
Really great to watch.
Yeah, Hot Fuzz is the Simon Pegg's follow-up to Shaun of the Dead, but it's very much a Wicker Man.
Yeah, it's a guy coming in, believing he's right, and finding the entire corrupt community around him.
And then Ingrid Pitt, again, would have been well known to horror fans from her roles in The Vampire Lovers and Countess Dracula, The House That Dripped Blood. But again, she doesn't have a lot to do, but because she has such a striking presence, especially, curled up naked in a wash basin. But I love her. I love it whenever she shows up. And the fact that she plays this kind of tightly wound librarian and then, reveals her true self. I wonder how much of that was a performance on the librarian's part to play the role of a librarian.
One of the things I like about the movie is that it is subversive. It is constantly subverting your expectations. Christopher Lee's performance is subversive. It is completely different than anything you've probably seen him do before. And he's, as Katie said, the most rational, well-spoken, charming, which is not what you expect from the leader of this cult or
any cult, system. Right? That's not what we've come to believe cult leaders behave like.
And so everything in there is organized to, you think it's going to go this way, and then suddenly it turns. So you are in Sergeant Howie's shoes because you don't know what's going to happen next. Nobody is acting the way you would expect a community with a missing child to act. It is constantly pushing you off guard.
Well, and I think unless you're familiar with paganism, everybody's behaving different than you expect people to behave. Overall, like the rituals are unfamiliar to us. The way they communicate with one another is unusual to us. We would never expect, again, going back to the landlord's daughter song, that you're going to talk about what a slut this girl is, and everybody's like, yeah, and she's like, yeah, it's awesome. It goes completely counter to our expectations. I think we have to talk about the music at this point because it's a musical.
It is
again, not a thing you're expecting when you come into it. But Paul Giovanni was our composer, and I just love all of the folk songs that he brings in. And they all kind of, in some ways, act as a Greek chorus, throughout as well. They're kind of informing and giving us knowledge about the events that are happening on screen or that will happen or have happened.
The Maypole song really gets in your head.
Yes.
And it's a good, it talks about the theme of the death and rebirth and all of that. So it's really fitting too.
There's a song that Christopher Lee is singing with I don't recall
Diane Cilento.
Yeah. And it's a song about a tinker and this lady who's trying to get him to fix her pot, and it's all about and what he's saying is, lady, your pot is worn out. I can barely, and it's not really the pot they're talking about. So I think that was...
Strangely enough, it's not a music that really interests me in the film. So that's maybe the part I like the least. Yeah. But yeah, it makes total sense that it's in there. And like you said, it really acts as a chorus and how it really tells everything about the film. It's the explanation of everything, but without being too direct about it.
I enjoy the landlord's daughter song and the joy with which it is performed. But I also that Corn Rigs song really gets you and keeps coming back, and it so misdirects you from what's really going on here and the insidiousness of it. I really enjoy that.
It was very hard to get a soundtrack for this movie for
a
long time. And I found one at one of the local sort of alternative record stores, like 30 years ago, and I was so excited to get that. And one of the few movies from back from this era that I can think of that in America we tried something similar was a movie called The Legend of Hillbilly John, it was an adaptation of a pulp novel by a guy named Manly Wade Wellman, who told stories about witchcraft in Appalachia. And so for that, they used like bluegrass and country music and talks about deals with the devils. I don't think it really went into sex quite as much anywhere near as much as this one, but no, I just remember being excited getting that album.
Well, I do have to tell a personal story because when my wife and I were just starting to date, like it was in the early 2000s, and for Christmas one year, I had mentioned, that I'd seen The Wicker Man recently and I really loved it. And I'd been, wanting to see it for a long time. And she showed up on Christmas morning with the Wicker Man soundtrack and a Wicker Man t-shirt. And I was like, oh my gosh, you're the one, you are the one. And I love that soundtrack. And it's funny to go back to this movie now because I know all of these songs so well. And because from the opening credit song of that kind of droning, as the plane is flying in, all the way to the end with Summerisle coming in, where they're all just standing out there singing along and swaying their arms, like from beginning to end, it just feels like the music fits this movie so well, and it works in a way for me that I would never have expected it to. It plays counterpoint to everything that's happening, like all of the awfulness. There's a missing child, and now there's like, and nobody's helping, and blah 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 blah, and then everybody's just all jolly about it. It's just
they're just having an orgy on the lawn.
Right,
missing
out in the cemetery.
Well, it's funny because it is a counterpoint to the point of view of our protagonist, but it is completely in line with the residents of Summerisle, because there is not a missing child. And it's that weird, if you go back and watch, it's like everything they're doing makes sense once you actually understand. It's like, oh yeah, no, there is no missing child.
Yeah.
Yeah, she's fine. It's just part of their
They're
ritual.
saying all the lines they're supposed to say. They're telling him all the things that they're supposed to tell him, but they know that none of it is true. And so it comes across so disjointed and weird and confuses him, which is exactly what it's supposed to do. But they're all bad actors. Like nobody's like, when they finally admit that Rowan is missing, nobody's upset about it.
Right.
Or that she's buried there under her rowan tree or anything. Like nobody's sad about it.
That weird little moment, speaking of in a movie that's full of weird little moments, but the weird little moment with the beetle that's tied to the string.
Daisy.
Very good.
It says everything. If I remember it right, it's a beetle who's always doing the same movements, who's trying to get out. It's kind of like torture for him or something, but then
pulls it up tight toward the thing.
Yeah.
You can't go in a different direction.
It always happens that way. It's just how we're doing it. So that's really, they're just talking about him and what's going to happen to him. He can do whatever he wants. He just goes to the same direction. That's what they're doing. It's not, for them, it's not horrible. It's just, for them, it's just life. It's what they're doing.
They give him so many clues. What they're doing to him, but because he keeps going in the same direction,
but who would ever think that something like this is going to happen?
Well, and there's a great book by Alan Brown that I highly recommend to people. It's called The Wicker Man: How Not to Make a Cult Classic. Thank you. Now, Alan, I was going to ask, he also wrote Inside the Wicker Man. Is that a different book, or is that just an updating of, or is this one an updating of that?
I don't know. I was just lucky enough to find this at my bane of my existence, Half Price Books, the other day. So I read it, and it's amazing the number of backstories that are on there. I don't know if that's a different book. And of course, there is another book that just came out this year from Titan Publishing. It's this huge color book that I don't have of photography and things from the movie.
Well, and the reason I bring that up is that because this movie did have a very troubled release. As I mentioned in the introduction, it had some studio imposed trims because British Lion, who produced the film, they were bought by EMI Films. And as they mention in there's a Wicker Man Enigma on the Anchor Bay DVD release, but they talk about like whenever a film studio changes hands, that immediately the new owners are like, get rid of that old stuff. That's garbage. We're not going to be associated with that. And this was right at the cusp of that, where they're just like, get rid of that movie. And, you know, they made these chops and they sent it out to America, and Roger Corman was interested in distributing it, but he ended up not distributing it. But like, there's just all of these intrigue, and then they couldn't find the negative to reinstate the cut scenes because they'd apparently been taken away. And as the legend goes, they were buried under the M4
Landfill.
motorway as part of, you know, like just filling in the
Landfill.
the landfill. And Christopher Lee on the documentary is just kind of like, who does that? When would that ever happen? That you're going to take a bunch of film canisters and go shove them under a highway. But that's, you know, legendarily what happened. But I do recommend that book, Alan Brown, The Wicker Man, How Not to Make a Cult Classic. Tons of great behind the scenes stories. Diane Cilento, who plays our school teacher, she was actually married to Sean Connery for a time. And then she ended up marrying our screenwriter, Anthony Shaffer. And so this has a happy connection in that regard. Anthony Shaffer had also written the play and then the subsequent screenplay for the film Sleuth, starring Laurence Olivier and Michael Caine.
He wrote the screenplays for a lot of mysteries back then. A lot of Agatha Christie adaptations too. So yeah, it comes as no surprise that this one is a mystery too.
Mhm.
Well, and that's the strongest thing about it is the fact that it's so, as you say, when you watch it the second time and the third time and the fourth time, so much is there, but it isn't there at first. It's all in plain sight, but we don't see it the same way Sergeant Howie doesn't see it.
Yeah, it's definitely a film you have to watch several times, I think, because each time you watch it, you find new things.
I was interested in reading in that Alan Brown book about, he talks about the sequel that they had tried to write.
Yeah.
Right.
And to me, this is a phenomenal idea. And again, some of this information they said in this book is out of date or has been disproved. But I think in the idea was, we're going to pick it up right where we left off. And in the sequel, they had planned to have like a helicopter rescue Sergeant Howie at the last minute. So he survives, but he has to recuperate because he gets all burned. So he tried to get as many of the original actors they wanted. And they said, well, it's 20 years later. How do we explain this? Pick it up. And they said, well, everybody would be older, but the idea was it picks up immediately right after. But the gods had cursed them because their sacrifice failed. So it made them old, rather than bring vitality to the land and everything. That's a fantastic idea.
That's some old school Dungeons and Dragons
Actually,
stuff right there.
That was supposed to be the third part because it was supposed to be a trilogy. And Robin Hardy once told me that, he was making the third part after The Wicker Tree. And it was exactly about that story, about the wrath of all these deities. Yeah, I love that idea.
Cool. Yeah.
And I did see The Wicker Tree not recently. I saw it when it came out, and I was less than pleased with the results. It doesn't help the fact that we've already done The Wicker Man. So it's kind of like, well, we know what's happening. You know, we know the background. What works so well in The Wicker Man is that we don't understand this world. And once you get into a sequel, you're kind of like, well, okay, I know what's happening now. And it's hard to have the same sense of mystery.
Particularly with movies like where there's a big reveal. It's sort of like, that's the end of the story. You know, you wouldn't have a sequel to The Sixth Sense where now you know
Right.
Bruce Willis is just a ghost solving crimes. You know, it's like, no, that story ended.
Don't give Hollywood any ideas.
Oh, stop it.
I just wanted to say also that I read a novel that Robin Hardy wrote. And I thought that worked so much better because it's actually well written and there's still a lot of good ideas in the book. But I think it just doesn't work as a film, again, because so many people already know the structure and what's going to happen and everything. And also I thought that the main characters, the Christian people, were really cheesy and annoying. And I think they were supposed to be that way, but it was really hard to watch that. But I think as a book it works way better.
Yeah, and I think that kind of goes back to what I was saying, where even if we don't like Sergeant Howie, we like what he's trying to do. Whereas in The Wicker Tree, basically, they're going to try and convert these pagans. And you're kind of like, well, I'm not on your side. You know, like you're just trying to impose your values on somebody else. Like it's hard to get on board with that unless you're like a devout Christian. And it's like, but Sergeant Howie is a Christian and also a police officer, and those two things work really well together.
But regarding The Wicker Tree, I actually saw it for the first time not long ago, and that was in preparation for this actually. And I agree with a lot of what you said about it actually, and I think their characters' motivations and such are not. It feels a little bit like they don't. In the Wicker Man, everything makes sense if you know the ending, but here it's just like the characters, things happen because they need to happen for the plot more. Maybe that works better in the book. The Wicker Man, yeah, you see a lot more when you see it again, like what I said with when he is dressed like the fool and such. It's just a lot of things you realize. And the beetle going around, you realize that, yeah, okay, I see what this means now. You didn't know that originally.
I look forward to repeated future viewings of this movie to delve deeper into it. I'm glad I watched it for this.
Like I said, it had been decades between the last time I saw it and when we watched it a month ago. And it was obviously, I knew the ending for most of my life. But yes, when you go into it, it just holds up as an experience, that it is, even if you know the ending, it's one of those movies that's like where the penny drops at the end, and then you can go back and watch it all again and see all of the things that are going on and why they are happening. So it actually leads to a deeper appreciation for the material on a second viewing.
It's true that when you don't know what's going to happen or how the movie is going to end, that's going to be a big surprise if you watch it for the first time. But even if you do know everything and you've watched the entire episode here with all the spoilers, I think there's so much to discover in this film. And it's also, I think it's first of all that Robin Hardy didn't really wanted to make a horror film or thriller. He really wanted to make a reflection on religion and on belief. And that's what it really is at the basis, even if for us we do see and experience it as a horror film. But yeah, it has so many interesting elements, so many details. You can watch the film 10 times and still discover new things.
I would say in addition to being, of course, a beautiful, excellent film, without it, we would not have had maybe this resurgence in the interest in folk horror that we have now, with Midsommar and that Severin box set that came out. The only thing I can think of similar to this was the movie Eye of the Devil that was made, I think, a few years before that with David Niven and with Sharon Tate, which has a very similar plot of the aristocrat of, I think it's in France, has to come back and basically be sacrificed to make sure the vineyards are growing. So
Midsommar feels like a Wicker Man in Sweden sometimes.
Yep.
Oh no, Midsommar is absolutely, kind of like an inversion of the Wicker Man. We're going to be talking about Midsommar next year. So stay tuned for that. Kind of to your point, Chris, you can watch Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho multiple times and appreciate all of the skill that goes into it. And it isn't all about the reveal. Like it isn't just about the reveal. And I feel like that's like when you get that information and you go back in your head, as the credits are rolling and you're like, wait, so all of that meant this. And then you watch it again. It's not like it's a lesser experience. It's actually a deeper experience. And I feel the same thing about The Wicker Man. I feel like it's just one of those things that deepens and deepens as it becomes more and more familiar to it. you enjoy it. You find yourself singing along with the songs, and you find yourself on the side of the Summer Islanders. You're like, oh yeah, summer is a coming in. Thank you all so much. This was a really fun conversation and a great way to kind of wrap up the year. So here's to a fantastic ending and rebirth. And looking forward to having you all back on again very soon.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Until next time, keep searching, keep exploring, and keep sharing the scare.